think we'll get started. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Very good. I'm Dan Tietz. I'm the Chief Special Services Officer at the city's Department of Social Services, Human Resources Administration. I'm pleased to moderate this panel today on intimate partner violence and addressing intimate partner violence in the context of supportive housing. And I'm pleased that we've got some great panelists here with us today. I should note that I'm not quite sure why they asked me to do this. However, I oversee, among other things, the domestic violence services and shelters in New York City, and work very closely with Lisa Rachmuth, who's on that team, and Deputy Commissioner Maureen, who's in the back of the room, who I think many of you may know. So a little louder.
The mic is not working.
It sounds like it is up here. You may want to move forward. The speakers are in the front of the room, so if you're having a tough time hearing, you may want to move forward. So let's go ahead and get started. I think some of what we want to talk about today, of course, and it's in your program as well, is really focused on our efforts to outline the issues of intimate partner violence so that we all sort of understand that in the same way. Identify some potential solutions and highlight best practices for addressing intimate partner violence in the context of supportive housing. And then give you real practical tools to address the issues in your supportive housing settings. We're going to have each of the panelists speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll take questions afterwards. We're going to leave plenty of time for a lot of back and forth. So if folks would, if questions come up for you in the course of the presentations, if you would make notes, we'll just save those questions until all three panelists are through with their presentations. So we'll start with Joscelyn Truitt, who's here, the Director of Programs and Community Partnership at the Brooklyn Family Justice Center in the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence. She'll be followed by Maureen, Vice President of Criminal Justice Programs at Safe Horizons. And then lastly, we'll hear from Lisa Rachmuth, the Director of Clinical Initiatives and Programming at the Human Resources Administration Office of Domestic Violence. So, Joscelyn.
Great, thank you. All right, does this work? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much for having me today. Thank you, Dan. I just wanted to start off by explaining a little bit about what the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence does, in case there are some of you in the room who haven't worked with us or heard of us before. We are a city agency, a small city agency, but we essentially have three primary goals. The first is to coordinate citywide services for victims of domestic violence. The second is to impact policy and provide training to partners on the ground and to other city agencies when requested. And the third is to conduct extensive outreach in New York City communities, talking to constituents and informing them about what their rights are around domestic violence. So under that first goal, coordinating services for victims, we have the Family Justice Center model. And the Family Justice Center, which is governed under the Mayor's Office, is a multidisciplinary walk-in crisis center for victims of intimate partner violence, elder abuse, and sex trafficking. And this model, we believe, is quite effective because we have, 24 some odd service providers. So services are actually provided by community-based organizations and other city agencies that serve our clients, like Safe Horizon and HRA. But we essentially provide extensive case management, civil legal advocacy, criminal justice advocacy, civil legal services, immigration services, counseling and mental health, practical and financial resources, particularly for people in emergency situations, and economic empowerment and education programs. We serve anybody, regardless of their identity or their status, as long as they are the identified victim in that relationship. And it's important just to note that we do not work on cases of family domestic violence. We do solely take cases of intimate partner violence. But all of our services are free and confidential, and we've really been doing a lot of work to make sure that all folks feel that they are welcome to come in, see a screener, do an intake, and get connected to services. So with that being said, I'm really happy to be here today because I believe that collaborating and coordinating with other service providers is so important in assuring the safety of our clients and promoting their prosperity, right? And I, particularly for special populations, and I encourage our staff, whenever possible, to reach out, to make connections, and to make sure that we are, contributing our own strengths, our agency strengths, to make sure that our clients are safe and that they stay safe as best that we can. So let's, I think, first start off by defining intimate partner violence. I think, for folks who've seen all types of cases like this, has anybody in the room, who in the room, if I could just ask, is doing direct service, so working one-on-one with your residents? Okay, all right, that's good to know. So intimate partner violence is defined as when one partner in a relationship exerts a pattern of controlling and sometimes violent behavior in an effort to gain power and control over the other partner. So some of you may know that, some of you may have done extensive domestic violence work in the past, but I think it's important to distinguish between sort of unhealthy relationships, which we see folks coming in where there may be mutual violence in the relationship, or in family cases of domestic violence where one family member may have situational violence with another family member. We really are screening folks to understand what the power and control dynamics are. And we also see a lot of this in elder abuse cases where one person is particularly vulnerable, maybe because of their age or disability, and there's another family member that's using similar tactics to gain access to financial resources, access to medication, access to housing, whatever it may be. So just thinking about power and control and what those tactics might be, we most often associate that with physical violence and assault. And I think that it's important to note, when thinking about lethality and risk, that there are certain indicators, certain types of violence that we see that are important to note when talking with clients, because we know based on our, the crime statistics that we've gathered, based on, intimate partner violence homicides that we've studied, to note that physical violence is something to be very aware of and keen to and definitely to be cautious about, right? But there are other tactics that our clients experience that sometimes can go overlooked. The emotional abuse, right? Ongoing years of shaming and berating and name calling. Financial abuse, which we see a lot at the family justice centers, so committing financial fraud against a partner, cases of identity theft, controlling all household finances, sexual abuse, coerced or forced sex within a relationship, using community or religious ties to exert power and control. So using scripture maybe to justify abuse, or the shame and isolation that one could face if they were to leave their community or to leave their relationship, what that looks like. Whether it's using immigration status or technology or using the children or potential custody and visitation battle, whatever that might look like. These are all different forms and tactics that we try to recognize to get a full picture of the types of risks that our clients could face, either if they stay in the relationship or if they choose to leave. I think particularly with your populations, it's important to note that for special populations with mental health issues or substance abuse issues or physical disabilities, this idea of sort of gaslighting folks and making folks feel dependent, or that if they were to go and report abuse or report crimes against them, that they wouldn't be believed or that they wouldn't be taken seriously. This is another area that we unfortunately see a lot when we were dealing with clients who have had long-term dependencies on their partners because of a mental health issue or needing to have somebody regulate their medications or doctor's visits or whatever that might be. So when you have a client in your office who's facing the decision, about a decision to make about a domestic violence situation and is dealing with lots of symptoms of trauma, what does that look like, right? And I think one of the things that we can often see, and those of us who are who are service providers, is this element of resistance, and that can be particularly frustrating. But what we really try and encourage our partners to understand is that trauma can look like all types of different things, right? Some clients are unable to remember details, unable to tell a linear story, may have flashbacks or intrusive thoughts, are dealing with anxiety, or are hypervigilant in the interview, are experiencing depression, or are socially withdrawn, or are just flat out angry and upset and frustrated. And that can come off in different ways, right? And we also deal with clients who are, battling, deep poverty and have had experiences with other systems that have impacted their relationship to either supportive housing or to, the criminal legal system or to, the Department of Social Services, whatever that might be. So taking into account that all of these different signs and symptoms of trauma are important, and being aware of your making conscious decisions about your body language, your choice of language, verbal and nonverbal cues, practicing empathic interviewing techniques, all of these things, because in order to properly assess risk, right, we have to be able to begin to build a strong rapport with clients. And in order to build a strong rapport with clients, we have to understand where they are at that moment that they come to us and are in our offices. And so with that, I think also addressing the gravity of the decision that they may be about to make is really important. I think, our priority as service providers is to keep our clients safe. We want to know that when our clients are leaving, that they're not going to face a reassault or, God forbid, an intimate partner violence homicide, to be killed, right? And so our priority is really to figure out what all of the physical and violence risks might be, but not addressing the fact that clients have, and I know Maureen's going to talk a little bit more about this, but all of these other life risks to consider, whether that's loss of affordable or stable housing, whether that's facing deep poverty, whether that's going forward with a custody case that could be potentially, potentially harmful or painful for somebody, whether that's, losing hope for the future. You've been, in an intimate partnership with somebody for so many years, and then all of a sudden having to make this very serious and life-changing decision is a lot for clients. And then on top of that, layered with the other challenges, be it mental health issues, be it substance abuse issues, be it lack of access to resources. So now when we talk about risk, like I said, first and foremost, we're thinking about reassault or potential intimate partner violence homicide. And based on what we know, that's an important risk to consider. In the United States, it's over 1 in 3 women has faced stalking, sexual violence, rape, or physical violence in a relationship, and over 1 in 4 men has experienced the same. In New York City, I don't have the statistics for 2016, maybe Maureen does, but NYPD received over 300,000 calls to respond to domestic incidences. That's an incredible number of reports that police are generating every day, strictly related to domestic violence. At the Brooklyn Family Justice Center alone, which is where I work, we see about 100 people a day. So we know that domestic violence is an issue, and we know that the risk of physical assault and potential homicide is what we most often look out for. We also look out for whether or not there's been a strangulation or a choking incident, whether or not the abusive partner has access to guns or lethal weapons, whether or not that person is unemployed and therefore unoccupied, whether that person has made threats to harm before, and most importantly, what the survivors or what our clients' perception of risk is, right? I've sat with clients before who have said, I know I don't have any bruises, I know I don't have any broken limbs, but I just know this person is going to do something to me. I just know it, right? And so we have to take that very seriously. And then, of course, for some of you, you may have experienced an instance where a client has had to make a decision to leave, and that is the most dangerous time for clients. And it really requires this very careful process of safety planning, which is what we'll get into. But realizing and respecting the client's perception of risk means accepting their right to self-determination. Now, that might come with some restrictions, for those of us who are law enforcement, that comes with certain restrictions, or depending on what your agency's rules and regulations or practice models are, that might restrict you in some ways from fully being able to realize clients' right to self-determination or respecting their decision to stay. For instance, I would suppose if there's been violence on housing grounds, that might mean that some action has to be taken, right, or somebody has to be called. I'm sure a lot of us in this room are mandated reporters, so what does that mean when ACS becomes involved, right? And I think because we're at a housing conference, realizing that access and challenges around affording housing in New York City for our clients is an incredible challenge, and I think oftentimes is a risk factor that far outweighs sometimes the risk of staying in an abusive relationship. And so what does it mean to have a conversation about abuse and violence when that person is facing homelessness or facing, being uprooted and not having anybody to rely on? So I just, and sort of, I hope this segues into what Maureen is going to be talking about, but this idea of safety planning, we do lots of trainings with the mayor's office about what assessing risk and what safety planning looks like, and I think it's important to demystify or unveil this idea that a safety plan is something that is specifically taught and is a certain practice that one must follow, because the first thing to realize is that our clients are always safety planning. Whether it's among themselves or with their friends or family, our clients have gotten to us in some capacity, right? So they know what their safety looks like. They know what risks they're facing, and they know, what potentially could happen to them. So I've done hundreds of safety plans with clients, and they've all looked different. They're dynamic, they're creative, they're individualized. They don't follow a strict pattern. And so I'll leave it there, because I think we'll go through, but I want to encourage you all, if you are in the capacity where you are seeing clients or your staff are seeing clients who have gotten to this point where they need to make this very oftentimes heavy and sometimes dangerous decision, that collaborating with intimate partner violence, domestic violence advocates can be so important, but it is also something that any advocate, in whatever capacity you're working with clients in, should feel empowered to do. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. And just before I forget, I've left stuff up front. Yeah. Go ahead. I've left stuff up front. So if you do wish to refer clients or reach out to the Family Justice Centers, I'm more than happy to get you that information so that you know how to do that. Okay? Thank you.
Let's just take a moment maybe to, I just want to ask a couple of questions of the room and then maybe of the panelists as well, given your presentation. How many in the room have had to deal with incidents of intimate partner violence in your programs? Oh my. So this, I think, goes a little bit to your point of, sadly, the prevalence, the widespread, this is a very current issue for folks, and knowing how to deal with it. One of the things that occurred to me as you were speaking, Joscelyn, is do we have good templates or models for, if you will, model policies and procedures for something like a supportive housing program that people could, a place for them to start? And this could be any of you to reply.
Sure, you mean in terms of assessing risk and things like that?
And then and I think ensuring safety and like how it would work. I mean, it's very different in a supportive housing program versus, a home in the community, living by yourself, if you will, with your abuser or potentially being at risk in the community. But here, you've got a program.
Right. And I think, and we sort of talked about this a little bit when we were preparing to come here today, but I'm assuming that everybody in the room your respective agencies have their own policies and procedures in terms of how, you're intaking clients and keeping track and maintaining information and all of that. Am I correct on that? Assuming that. So I do think that there are definitely ways to strengthen, and are there risk assessment or domestic violence, if you could just raise your hands again, sort of intake models that are built into so a few of you, yes. So, there are different risk assessment tools that have been developed by researchers who have looked at crime statistics and have followed homicide patterns and are able to kind of point out, of course, one that we refer to a lot in Safe Horizon and with our agency is the Jackie Campbell Danger Assessment Model. Some of you may have heard of it, but it's essentially a 20-question risk assessment tool that is more looking at lethality, right? So working with folks who are in a potentially fatal situation and need to make a more comprehensive safety plan, so picking out some of those very grave lethality factors, which I mentioned earlier. And so we do trainings on that, and we're sort of happy to come to your agencies and talk more about that. But like I said, I think with safety planning, and there's this kind of intimidation that, doing a safety plan is something that you sort of have to be trained and taught to do, I think is very instinctual at the bottom of all of it, right? And it's important to maintain kind of an individualistic approach, right? So depending on what that client's situation is, and depending on what the agency procedures and rules and regulations are that you have to follow is sort of where you start. So I don't know.
I'd just like to add that doing a safety plan really, really starts with the client. And they're the ones who generally guide it. They're the ones who will tell you at the inception of sitting and talking to them what their fears are, what their concerns are, and no issue is minimal when they're talking about their safety or the safety of their families. And it can be a tool that's as simple as sitting with someone and saying, how do you keep yourself safe? What got you here today so that you were able to sit here and talk to me? And you start from there, and you can move on from that point. And it is extremely individualized. No two safety plans are going to look alike. Even, identical twins will have different safety plans. So it's just really important to note that it really does start with the client who's sitting with you.
And I just want to add that I think that what Joscelyn said about working together is critical. You're not going to have the same expertise and not expected to have the same expertise as domestic violence advocates would have. So working together. So for, the best policies that I believe agencies can have are those that have been vetted and looked at by somebody from the domestic violence world who can say, yes, this is client-centered, this is looking at, victims' needs and what's happening in the domestic violence world. And I think that, yes, safety planning is individualized, and, but it's knowing that there are people out there and building those relationships so that just like you may be able to help us in some ways, we can help you in other ways. So good afternoon. So my name is Maureen Curtis. I oversee the criminal justice programs for Safe Horizon, and that is staff working at the family justice centers, our criminal courts, family courts, police precincts, and housing program. And I have been working in the field for more than 30 years now. I started when I was 2. Yeah. And for most of my career has been working closely with the law enforcement and courts. So I have a lot of expertise in terms of these systems. I think that the overview that Joscelyn gave you was great, and I just want to add on and talk to you about from Safe Horizons perspective, because we're a large agency. We're the largest victim services agency in the country. We work with all victims of crime. Probably about 60% of the clients that we do work with are victims of domestic violence. And that could be intimate partner violence or family violence. And we, one of the main things that we do is we do safety assessments and what we call risk management planning, which is also known as safety planning. And there's a little bit of a difference between safety assessments and risk assessments. Risk assessments, as Joscelyn pointed out, is looking at the potential risk, and it focuses on the behaviors, most often, of the opposite party, the person who is causing the harm to that victim. Safety assessment is really looking at the situation from the victim's perspective. We changed our practice probably about now 10 years ago and became client-centered. And I've been with the agency, as I said, a long time, and if you had asked me prior to that, was our agency client-centered, I would have said, of course we are. You know, we support clients' decisions, we're where the client is at. And since we officially changed our practice and started training and learning more about it, we realized that, you know, client-centered is not as easy as it looks. For example, many of our programs we're embedded in the criminal justice system. So we have staff working in courts, in family court, criminal courts, in police precincts. We're co-located in the child advocacy centers. And that means that oftentimes we are services and systems driven. So what does that mean in terms of being client-centered, in terms of doing a safety assessment with a client? Well, that means that, and I'm going to be the first to, you know, put myself out there, that probably 10, 15 years ago, if I was working with a victim of domestic violence and they came to me and let's say I was working in one of the family courts and they said to me that I'm looking to a petition for an order of protection. That's my expertise. I can, you know, give you all the information you need without sitting down with that person and listening to their story and hearing other risks, as Joscelyn pointed out, that they may be identifying. I would have went right into helping that person petition and get an order of protection. One, because that's what they asked for, so I'm being client-centered. Two, it's my expertise. I understand the systems. This is a very complicated system, so I'm doing my job by helping that person navigate that system and get what it is that they said they wanted. But what we learned was that is not being client-centered. Because if I really sat down and talked with that person and listened to that person's situation, my job is to listen for the risks that they are identifying. Because now they're coming to me, most often victims come to us because of the physical risk. There has been physical violence or threat of physical violence in the relationship, so they're coming to us for services. So we're going to meet that need. But what we've learned is that at the same time they're talking to us about the assault that may have occurred or the threat that may have happened, they're also telling us about other risks. And because we weren't really listening for them, we weren't hearing them. As Joscelyn pointed out, there could be emotional risk. There could be life-generated risk. There could be systems risk. For example, a client who comes to me who I'm working with, who's, say, in a very violent relationship physically, I can guarantee you, even today, it's hard for our advocates to move past that physical violence because in my head, I'm thinking, I want that person in shelter. I want that person out of that relationship because that's the most safest solution for that person. But if that person in my assessment, they're telling me that in talking about their situation, that one of their children, say, has autism. And after years of trying to find a good school, I found a great school in the Bronx that my child is thriving in. And I didn't hear, now they're identifying a risk. So now if they go into shelter, they potentially have to pull their child out of that school. If I don't address that with my client, I've missed an opportunity to allow the client, and we talk about decisions, to say which risks they want to identify. Because maybe they'll say, I don't want my child to be pulled out of that school, and I don't want to go into shelter if that means that I have to pull my child out of that school. So now the conversation becomes, and they may decide, the risk to me physically is so great that I have to pull my child out. But at least I've heard it, I've acknowledged it, I've talked with them about it, and the client is making an educated decision as to what risk they want to focus on. And it could be that, it could be the physical risk. Talk about systems risk. An example of a systems risk is, in this day, immigration. Some of our clients are afraid to come forward to the courts to the police, and yet these are systems for victims of domestic violence that are traditionally often used for safety planning. Call the police if you need assistance. You can get an order of protection if you want to keep yourself safe. So what does that mean now if I'm an immigrant, or let's say I'm not an immigrant, I just have fear of the police, or I don't believe that my husband or wife, who's the person causing harm to me, is going to respect or have fear of the police, or I have fear, or maybe I don't have fear for myself, but I want the violence to stop, but my husband, if he's now arrested, could potentially be deported. So acknowledging that, as opposed to going right into talking about what we consider oftentimes traditional safety planning. And I think client-centered work is also being non-judgmental. And once again, very difficult to do, because judgment is not just negative. Judgment can be positive judgment, it can be directive judgment, or it could be negative. And we see that many of our staff, they receive 40 hours of training, and we do ongoing training and reinforcement, supervision. We have, yearly, what we call in-depth case review, where we look at our staff work with clients. And what we see is we've gotten very good. We don't hear our staff using negative judgments, such as like, you did what? What did you say? But what we do hear is, you should get an order of protection. You should. So that is now, we're falling into telling the client what to do, as opposed to talking with the client. It's not to say that you shouldn't talk about an order of protection, because if that's an option that the client wants to hear about and it matches the risk that they've identified, our job as advocates is to be savvy and knowledgeable about that, but to explore it as an option and not tell the person. Because I've learned Maureen is looked upon as an expert. Clients often say to me, well, tell me, Maureen, what should I do? Or what would you do, Maureen? And we have to talk to our advocates about, be careful, because while you are an expert, and you should be an expert in many ways, you're there to explore the options and talk with the person about what's available for them. So I think the other thing that's really important in client-centered work is, what happens, as Joscelyn mentioned, when they can't make their own decision. You're a mandated reporter. You have to call the state central registry because of something that the client has said about their children, or the violence or the neglect that you may be hearing, so you're obligated as a mandated reporter. Or, the person has called, or somebody called 911, and there's a mandatory arrest that could happen, and the client is telling you that they don't want an arrest. The important thing here is you're not going to change that. We know that we all have laws, policies, procedures, I'm sure everybody here, that we have to operate under, but knowing what those are and talking with that person, so now they may not still be happy about what has happened, but at least they have a better understanding about why this needs to happen. And this particularly is important when it comes to your policies. Your policies may not be, and I'm saying your policies, I've seen some policies that are not necessarily client-centered, where automatically it says in the policy, if there's a domestic violence incident, you must call 911. And if there's children involved, you must call the state central registry. That's not something that we would say is a good policy for domestic violence victims. But if that's a policy, and you now work for an agency that's their policy, your job, you have to follow the policy because you're the employee of the agency. But now understanding that policy, understanding the impact it can potentially have on your client, and being able to explore that with the person sitting in front of you. I think that as Lisa said, I think what's also really, really important is to know that safety planning has to be individualized and changes all the time. It's not, one time fits all. And it's also, I think one of the questions we were asked to address is safety planning is not always about leaving. And it's not just leaving right then and there. It's also not about, okay, when you're ready to leave, this is what you need to do to prepare to be ready to leave. We know, and we've learned this over the years, doing work with victims of domestic violence, many of them do not want to end the relationship. And that means today, tomorrow, next year. They don't want to end the relationship. And I think sometimes that's hard to accept. If you were to ask me in the work that I do, what's the most troubling thing that we still see in this field is victim blaming. And that's at a society where we don't understand victims' decisions, particularly if they choose to stay. And sometimes they're staying not out of fear, as Joscelyn said, which is a big reason, but also because of love. They don't want the relationship to end. So knowing where you are in that is really important because, as Joscelyn also pointed out, your body language, your tone is important because you want to have that person, even if you're not going to talk to them as an expert, as you really, shouldn't be expected to, you refer, just making that referral and making them feel they were heard, they were believed, they were listened to. I can't tell you how far that can go for a person. And the last thing I would say is really, really know where you are in this. This is, I can't even imagine how difficult your work is, and I know our work is difficult as well. And, when we all should look at vicarious trauma. It's something that, our agency is almost 40 years old. It's only in the last 5 years that we've actually looked at vicarious trauma with our staff and started to really address it. And I think that that's really critical because this is hard work. And I think that, victim blaming, just, how we interact with the people that we serve, can be a part of our vicarious trauma. So I think that it's really important that you take a look at that and take care of yourself because it is really hard work.
Thanks, Maureen. If we could just get a show of hands, I want to know how many folks work in a scattered site program and congregate. How about family supportive housing? Oh, just a number. And singles? So the rest are singles, I presume? Yeah. So it gives you quite a mix, actually. That's actually a pretty mixed crowd. Because I think there's a big difference between working, you can tell me if you disagree when we get to your question part, working in a scattered site program where you're not, it's not an all-one building, you're not with the client every day, and you may hear things from the neighbors, you may hear things from the management company, you're not right there. In many respects, it's more like the work that each of you do in a kind of private market apartment and folks are coming to you or being referred to you versus a congregate setting where there's staff on site round the clock. Oftentimes others aren't, if you will, permitted to live there. They're not, so it's a different kind of environment. So I just think as we think about some of the comments that we're making here, just that in mind. I also want to know, just so thinking about the folks who are working in these programs, what do we have for resources? If folks wanted to, wanted to keep with their current work, they like where they are, but want more training on this subject, want to know more, is that among our materials? If you could just say a few words on that, maybe.
So I don't have any materials, I apologize, with me, but definitely Safe Horizon does tons of training, and we believe in partnering with the community, and that's various communities throughout New York City, because the more you know about it, the easier our job is. So I'm more than happy to make myself available to connect you to one of the local Safe Horizon programs in your area that can provide some training for you, and we have various expertise, so it's not just domestic violence 101, but it's systems, it's specific victimizations. So I can give you my number and you can reach out to me.
Sure, and
our agency, the mayor's office, has an entire group dedicated to doing training work with our partners on the ground. So if it's a request, I can direct you to the right person. But we sort of cover a lot of sort of intimate partner 101 type trainings. We do risk assessment training, sex trafficking training, engaging trauma survivors training, which is developing more around soft skills, and then sort of vice versa. So I'll make my pitch, which is that I'm always looking for folks to come on site, particularly on the housing end, because, it's just it's by far our biggest service need and want at the centers. So I'm always looking for folks, vice versa, to come on board and maybe give us a rundown of how we can be better trained on, referring folks for supportive housing or knowing how to connect people to the right resources. So I will just say that as well.
Great.
Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Rachmuth and I work with HRA.
You might want to just pull that a little closer.
Oh, sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. No? Okay. Lisa Rachmuth, I work with HRA. I am the Director of Clinical Initiatives and Programming, and I work with the non-residential programs as well as the domestic violence shelters. And I specifically would like to talk a little bit about crafting a continuum of care from shelter or non-residential services to supportive housing with a real focus on safety. Looking at safety, looking at risk for families coming into and individuals coming into supportive housing, and how we can really be collaborative partners in creating that continuum of care for the individuals that we serve on a daily basis. Sometimes adding another level of services to someone's life may not promote long-term interdependence. And I like to use the term interdependence as opposed to independence, because really none of us are truly independent. We all work with each other and we all have to work collaboratively on some level. And for some individuals and some families, that's harder because of the issues that they've had coming into our services or coming into your services. So focusing on that idea of interdependence gives you a much more full-bodied experience around collaboration. So working on the interdependence and safety, as there can be some confusion over what different service providers' roles are, and carefully working with individuals to identify their needs and what will promote health and interdependence requires detailed assessments and coordination with existing and future service providers. As Maureen and Joscelyn pointed out, collaboration is the key, and it really makes a big difference in the lives of families and individuals, but it also makes a big difference in your work. And I'm not saying across the board that your work will be all of a sudden lighter and easier by working collaboratively, but it will absolutely feel like you're sharing some of the responsibility with someone else or with another group of individuals. And it gives you, as that service provider, another level or another sense of relief to know that you can share the responsibility with someone else. At HRA, I focus on working with domestic violence shelters and service providers throughout the 5 boroughs. And just to tell you a little bit about our system, we currently consist of 54 shelters and serve approximately 2,700 individuals each day. Through a current RFP, as you noted, our system will expand to serve more than an additional 500 families and individuals. Our DV shelters offer families and individuals a safe place to be while they receive services to heal from domestic violence, and more specifically, intimate partner violence. We really focus on the intimate partner violence issues. The system's driven by service provision, with a strong focus on safety, both while in shelter and when leaving shelter. Providing services and focusing on safety are 2 reasons why many of our families and individuals in our DV system are well suited for supportive housing options. And we partner with a lot of supportive housing providers to really identify families that will be well suited to move into supportive housing. It is that effort to really find the right match. And individuals and families who identify that supportive housing is right for them are the ones that are the most successful. And I focus on that idea of identify. But before a family or an individual can identify supportive housing, they have to be educated. They have to understand what supportive housing means. They have to understand what, not just supportive housing, but what the service provision, the rich service provision that they might have available to them is. Some of our families, once they are leaving shelter or they're finishing with residential services, they say, I want to be left alone. I want that idea of independence. And they may not choose supportive housing, but giving them the information around what supportive housing has to offer could open their eyes to a potential either in the immediate or down the road. So it requires that as soon as a survivor enters any temporary housing situation, education of the available housing options be made clear to the families. Our service providers do that. They work with the families from the day they walk in to really understand what some of the potential options could be. And it's not telling, as Maureen pointed out, it is client-centered. It's not telling them where they're going to go when they leave shelter or they finish with a residential service provider, a non-residential service provider. It's really giving them the array of options and really educating them about what they have that is available to them long-term. Highlighting 4 ways in which supportive housing and DV services through shelter or non-residential services can mirror each other is really helpful to understand how closely connected we actually are in the supportive housing world and the domestic violence service world. We do safety planning. You might not realize it, but you are doing safety planning. You're doing safety planning with families when they come into your facilities or your housing. It happens just by telling them where they're living. That's the beginning of the communication around safety. Telling them what's available to them, what supports they have that they can rely on long term. That is part of creating that safety net for the family or individual. The infusion of de-escalation techniques when crisis occurs. How many of you actually participate in helping to diffuse crisis situations in your settings? So quite a few of you do that. And that is really something that brings you to the pivot point of understanding that what people are capable of. So when you have to de-escalate crisis, when you have to work with someone who is actually in the moment of crisis, you can realize and identify what they have in their handbag of tools so that they can use it in the future. And as the service provider, you pointing out and being aware of what they brought in their handbag of tools to that crisis situation, you can use later to help them to identify how they can replicate that if it was successful. If it wasn't successful, don't use it, okay? Get rid of it. Coordinated assessments. Coordinated assessments are not just on you. That is something that really requires multiple service providers to really work together and really emphasize what it means to identify what you have to offer this situation and what Joscelyn may have to offer this information, this client. We're all coming at this maybe from different perspectives. And we all have different areas of expertise and different things that we can offer families or individuals. And it's important to recognize that when we work together as a team, we're offering a whole lot more than when we work with a family or individual just as one. Offering to secure when needed releases of information that are clear to the client. And making the purpose and the rights around the release of information very clear to the client, and making that something that's meaningful to the client empowers. And when you can empower a client or a family or an individual in any area of the work, they are able to move forward into their own interdependence. Access to specialized service providers. Legal, physical, psychiatric, child welfare providers. All of those providers can really help to form that team that is coordinated. Safety planning needs to occur upon entry to shelter and exit from shelter, and whenever you are switching service providers. It's the responsibility of the new service provider to access safety with the client and help them to move forward in their safety planning. Safety of DV survivors involves not just the survivor and their immediate family. As you all probably have realized, whenever you've had an incident of crisis, it's not just that person who was involved in that crisis that's affected. It's you, it's your whole team that's working with the family, it's the other residents in that building or in that, wherever you're working, wherever they're living. Everyone's involved. And that real idea can bring us closer together and really having that collaboration and coordination. I just want to highlight, I want to give you a case example for a particular situation and really look at some of the dynamics of the situation so that you can really understand how safety planning is ever evolving, as Maureen talked about. It is ever changing, and sometimes we get rushed in the moment and we don't hear what someone may say in the moment, but that one or two sentence that they're saying might actually have told us something about the need to really reassess the safety plan right here and now. And being key and tuned into what the client is saying is so important. So being alert, being aware, and being present for the client when you are communicating with them. So I have a mother with 2 children. One child has severe medical needs, and the head of household, the mother, was diagnosed with PTSD. The family is fleeing from a very abusive husband and father, who's also someone who is closely connected to law enforcement. The safety plan in place includes maintaining the sick child's affiliation with the current medical provider and providing in-home respite for the mother. So as Maureen pointed out, sometimes we have families who, for a multitude of reasons, are unsafe staying in their particular situation with their abuser. But they hesitate leaving because of the other outliers. So in this particular situation, we're talking about the outlier of the child needing to receive medical attention from a particular medical provider. So we look at that very carefully, and we're going to look at the safety plan to help support that family. Because that mother's not leaving if she can't continue to get care for that child. So how do we support the mother being able to leave when she says, I want to leave? But, and the but is the big thing in this scenario. You really, as soon as someone says but, pay attention, because that really gives you information about what their concerns might be or aren't. So a new addition or additional service provider will need to be included in the safety plan and added as an additional resource for the survivor to access. When we talk about a family that has made the decision to move, or a family that has made the decision to seek services, whatever those services may be, we always look carefully at not just one member of the family. We look at the entire family. If you're working with individuals, you're looking at that individual's support networks as well. Cutting someone off from their supports might be the most unhealthy thing to do for that that individual or family. So really looking at that very carefully is very important when safety planning. So the safety planning may need to change as the environment changes. And the changes could include any of the following, and plus a multitude of others that I'm sure you can add to this list. Changes in family composition. So I'm going to guess that some of you have experienced families or individuals that have moved into your housing, your supportive housing environments, and now all of a sudden they'd like to move someone else in. They're in a new relationship. Because I'm a survivor of domestic violence or intimate partner violence does not mean that I don't want to be in a new relationship down the road. So that needs to be something that you really need to acknowledge with people. And as Maureen pointed out, there is no judgment. You really have to look at sometimes how you feel about these things and what your responses may be prior to the situation occurring. Because I know traditionally and years ago, I remember being in an emergency room with someone, and the service provider at the emergency room, the social worker, said to the woman, well, you can't go back, and you can't be with him anymore. Look at what he did to you. And that judgment made her not want to talk to this person anymore. So really sitting without the judgment is extremely important. Changes in the need for supports. So as families evolve, as maybe people get healthier, maybe people get sicker, we have to look at the changes in the family dynamics, the changes in the individual's need for supports. So this family that I'm referring to, that I gave you information on before, with the very sick child, if this child dies, how will this family composition change? How will the need for supports change? They might be enhanced on one level and they might be decreased on another level. So looking at that very carefully.
Lisa, I'm going to have you wrap up.
Okay. Changes in the abuse pattern with the ability for the service provider to measure for lethality and risk. And safety planning needs to be individualized, as we've all pointed out. Domestic violence providers work to help individuals and families transition out of the domestic violence shelter system. This is not always a smooth transition. The trust that is built between a service provider and the client may not be replicable or transferable. And I recommend that when a family or individual is transitioning from one situation to another, there be some level of soft handoff from one service provider to another. Best practices should directly focus on coordinated services that are aligned with the goals of the recipients of these services. Customized service safety planning should be developed in coordination with experts in IVP. Utilizing tools that are updated and able to be shared amongst service providers is key to providing intimate partner violence survivors with a network of safety as well as a support network. And I just want to conclude by saying it's really about the collaboration and working together and finding that fit that works for you, the service provider, the family, the individual, and the network as a whole. So thank you.
Thank you to all three of you. We're going to turn to the audience questions. I wanted to note, I think your presentation in particular brought up that by definition, folks here that we're talking about in this session, of course, are involved in at least one system already, right? So by definition, this is more than one system having to work to, sensibly, rationally serve an individual or family who has potentially multiple needs, just by definition, because they're in supportive housing. And the other thing I think came up, and I'll leave then to others to maybe speak further on, I think oftentimes folks don't want to give up, of course, the place they're at, right? So, and that's especially true possibly in supportive housing. So now they feel like I'm in a place that serves me well, I like where I am, this is the kind of program I want to be in, and the last thing I want to do is to pick up and go to some new address. And so then the safety planning
Yep.
gets that much more complicated because I want to stay in this program. I like where I am.
Yep.
So let's take questions from the audience. Questions, comments?
So we're going to be designing new supportive housing buildings.
So tell us who you are and where you work and what kind of program.
I'm Chris. I work for DePaul in Rochester, New York, and we do affordable housing, and our services are with people with a mental health diagnosis. But we, for the SHE round of funding, we're also talking with people that work in domestic violence. And one of the things we're wondering about are security features in the design, and what your thoughts on that might be.
So you're referring to the physical plant design of the building itself?
Right, so we'll have security cameras, we will have, the doors will be locked, you'll need a key card to get in, but if you had other ideas or thoughts on that.
Will the units have intercoms in them?
Yeah, and a video camera, so you'll be able to see who's at the door.
So you'll be able to see who's at the door, but will they be able to talk to whoever's at the door?
Yes.
Okay. That's one thing that's key. Who's going to be on staff on site, and what kind of hours will there be staffing?
So 7 days a week for at least 8 hours, there will be program staff. And then whenever the program staff aren't there, and including overnights, there will be contracted security at the desk.
I think that, I can't speak to the actual makeup of the building, but I think that, what's going to really matter is, do the two parties live together in that? Because that's going to change the security. So, for example, let's say they live there and now one person has been excluded. You might want to consider, if there's an order of protection, having the security guards, with the victim's permission, copies of the order of protection given to the security guards with the pictures so that they know that this person doesn't have access there. I think that safety planning with that person, going to and from the place, all of that is going to be critical. And I just want to add on to something that was said earlier that I think is really critical, that safety planning can happen in the home as well. So if the person is staying in the home, they can get an order of protection, because sometimes that the opposite party needs to stay there, for a variety of reasons. And the victim feels safe having that person stay with them, and that is going to work out, and there are other options that could make that happen.
I would also add that orienting the individuals or families to the community is key in safety planning.
Right.
Any new environment that anyone comes into, they could feel alienated from, local police or anyone else who's in the community. So really having a very concrete orientation to the neighborhood and to the community could be key for anyone to seek help if they need it. And just knowing your neighbors is really helpful in safety.
But I also just want to reiterate, and I've seen this a lot with folks who are experiencing stalking and harassment types of abuse, which can be incredibly frustrating to prove or to bring charges against, is the working use of cameras and having them strategically placed. I think is really important for prevention, but also for your residents that do choose a criminal legal path and want to be able to show or build proof that their partner or ex-partner is doing certain things. And I've particularly with our clients who live in public housing, have that obstacle a lot, where maybe they've gotten a safety transfer, so they've been able to secure a new apartment, yet that person has found out where they live and is gluing the locks, or, leaving feces at the door, or, throwing rocks at the window, or harassing them in small ways, and they're unable because maybe the buildings are old or don't have, the surveillance situated properly, are unable to prove that and unable to sort of move forward with filing for a violation. So that, I think, in prevention and in taking measures, actions towards punishment for the abuser or the offender is really important. But certainly, I think what the other ladies have said is training your staff to really be sort of trauma informed, so that people don't feel scared to come forward and say, look, I've had this incident, it happened off site, but I need you to know that this is what's going on. Can we make a plan, or can I inform people of what I need, right? Because sometimes it can feel very isolating to not have somebody to come, even if it is a security guard or a night guard or whomever.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I work for CUCS on the street outreach team. So we work with individuals who are currently street homeless, and typically we only work with single adults, but we have a case right now of 2 of our clients who are in a romantic relationship. They have been for some years, and it's really, really, really extreme intimate partner violence, like bloodied and bruised and broken bones. And we made small steps along the way, like we've had the person who's receiving the abuse in permanent housing, and then she promptly lost it, largely because of him and complicated stuff. But I guess my question is twofold. She never wants to press charges, ever, 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 ever. I can't even get her to think about making a safety plan. So are there any things that we can do to even just get her to start thinking about that? And then the second part of my question is, do you have any recommendations for us, as we still have to work with the person who's doing the abusing?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I wrote it down for myself earlier, which is, so do we have any models, any evidence-based models for serving the abusing partner? So thinking about circumstances where folks aren't going to separate, what can we do for the abusing partner? Anything?
So there are very few services for people who are abusing. I think that, and part of that is resources. There are batterer intervention programs that are primarily court mandated, but some of them are community referred or self-referred, and they could be. A lot of them are educational, but our experience, we used to run the Domestic Violence Accountability Program for many years, and it was court mandated. It used to be self-referred many years ago, but nobody ever came when it was self-referred. But when it's part of a court mandate, we had it was a program just for men. The men coming to the program. There is a program through. It's not, ACS funds it, Children's Aid Society, that is fairly innovative. The family wellness program that works with, right, so they work, they're from an accountability perspective, but they're also working with the individual who is causing the harm and addressing the trauma that person may have experienced in their lifetime. And I'll say lastly, our agency, as part of our 5-year strategic plan, and we're 2 years into that plan, we are looking at creating a program where, because historically, except for when we ran the batterers intervention program, we've never worked with the opposite party. We've only worked with the victim, but we're looking at the possibility of starting a program where we would work with the entire family, because we're seeing that many of our clients don't want to end the relationship, and if we want to serve them holistically, we have to give them more than what we're giving them now.
Just to add on to that, the family wellness program only works with individuals who are involved in the child welfare system. So there has to be that little caveat for that group. But there's another program currently through Edwin Gould Services, Steps to End Family Violence, that works with women who are identified as being abusive. And in most of those situations, there's some issue with they were actually protecting themselves. So there is programming for some people. It is very limited, and I'm working with a group right now, and we're trying to help identify some of the programming that is out there to work with abusive partners, and we need to do more of it. Honestly, we really need to change some of the ways that we think about working with abusers, and you're in that situation right now, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the Coalition on Working with Abusive Partners, Co-op, which is sort of includes Children's Aid Society and some other groups that are doing work on addressing behaviors that we're seeing abusive partners exert. One of the things that I think is important, because I'm sure all of you in this room are working with folks who have been abusive, are currently or have been at some point, is understanding that more than anything, it's about trauma, right? And we're starting to see that, and some of the science is starting to orient towards understanding that folks who have developed abusive patterns of behavior, that there's layers and layers of trauma that has to sort of be addressed before someone can truly take accountability and begin to change their behavior. And that's expensive when it comes down to thinking about services, right? Because that's many, many years of psychotherapy, supportive counseling, whatever it may be. But it's something that is very, very new in this sort of field of trauma research around abusive partners. But I understand that it's probably a huge obstacle for a lot of you, and I think, thinking about some type of mental health approach, more so than batterer's intervention, because we see. But for your first question about your client who has a lot of trouble realizing the situation, or doesn't want to press charges, or doesn't want to go forward, something that we see all the time, daily, with clients who come in and say, I don't even want to say domestic violence, just something's wrong. And that might mean, okay, until you get to the point where you do want to, act in a certain, take certain action, or you want to sort of address some of these challenges, just come and see me every week. Let's just make sure that you and I check in, even if we don't even discuss the domestic violence or the abuse that you're suffering at all. And we don't have to, this is totally up to you. And let's just, every other day, call me, or, come in and see me on Friday afternoon. Or not Friday afternoon, that's the worst time for people to come in, because that's when all the drama happens. But anyway, and maybe even referring clients who aren't quite there to, if they're to a domestic violence survivor group, right? If they are willing to see that there's domestic violence, sometimes it helps to really, on a peer level, be able to meet people who had trouble themselves. And this can be tricky because clients sometimes do get over-involved in other clients' domestic violence, histories and relationships, but having that kind of peer support is so important as well. So.
Anybody over here? Go ahead.
Okay, so hi, my name is Shay. I work for Women in Need. We are a client-based supportive housing program. So I have several clients who have domestic violence issues. I'm a case manager, so I work one-on-one with my clients. I wanted to know, is there like a harm reduction or risk reduction approach to some of these relationships that, like you explained, they don't want to leave, or they need them for certain other supportive things, or to help out with the kids, but it's not necessarily a healthy environment for the kids. But is there any type of approach that I can help them with? Like, even they come to me asking me, like, how can I make this like less harmful but stay in this relationship, Like, how can we do that?
So that is at the crux of safety planning. Working with that individual around what they need to identify that to help them stay safe. So let's take the example of visitation. Okay, you have weekly visitation with the abusive partner, and you meet at the local, local McDonald's weekly to drop off the kids. So safety planning around that particular drop off and pickup is really important. Identifying who leaves first, who brings the kids, and is there someone else that goes with you? Have you notified someone that this is what you do on a weekly basis, and how do you safeguard yourself? So maybe if you're doing the drop-off and getting onto a subway, you're making sure that person leaves before you and you're leaving with someone else. So things like that. So looking at the particular situation that the person brings to the table as being concerning to them, and then looking at that from a safety perspective. And that is safety planning. Absolutely.
And I think also in those cases, psychoeducation too, because I've sat with a lot of clients who've said, you know, I don't want to leave, but I just want the physical abuse to stop. And what can I do to make that happen? And again, really, I think that comes with a heavy conversation about this idea again of trauma and what and why abusers use these tactics in relationships. That it's more than the physical violence, right? It's more than the hitting and the bruises and the broken bones and things like that. That there's something very deep underlying that, and that's really what domestic violence is, right? It's this, I'm going to use violence against you because I want to control you. So maybe the violence stops, but does the control stop, right? And I think we have to sometimes have those conversations with clients because, you know, is there something I can teach you to do so that you don't get hurt every other day? That puts us in a tricky situation, right? You know, there have been all sorts of opinions about, do we teach clients self-defense, or how do we, because that could put them in an even more dangerous position. So again, in those cases, that sounds like the type of thing where, you know, again, you might want to reach out and maybe have, you know, someone at the Family Justice Center, Safe Horizon, do a risk assessment to see, okay, you're not going to leave, let's figure out how we can, you know, maybe help you get through those next steps.
Gentleman on the aisle.
I want to play devil's advocate here. Isn't there a percentage of abusers, whether male or female or heterosexual or homosexual, that are simply just pathological? They might not have come from an area of trauma at all. They simply, this is the way they conduct their lives. If this particular partner is not going to acquiesce, I will find another partner who will acquiesce. I will not rehabilitate. This is about control, and I like control. Isn't there a segment of human beings who just fall into that category? They're not recalcitrant. They are not going to rehabilitate. They are not interested. I would venture to say that it's a higher percentile of abusers fall into that than we're willing to admit.
There's no doubt that what you're saying is true. There are many people who are abusive simply for the reason that they can be abusive. And I think that, you know, when we talk about trauma, we're basically referencing in that, you know, what we have seen is that trauma is part of the person's story who may be the person who is causing harm to another. In no way do we say that trauma excuses or causes. It's like you've probably heard, you know, when you talk about, you know, domestic violence, that some people will say what causes domestic violence. You know, the reality is that, you know, I get angry and therefore I become violent. You know, the reality is that you and I could both be angry, you get violent, I don't, and it comes down to it's a choice. You know, you've chosen to get angry, I've chosen not to get angry. Or, you know, how many times do we know where the person who is causing harm causes harm only to that one individual? Meanwhile, other individuals in their life could have gotten them angry, could have gotten them upset, but they choose not to, and because there are consequences. So I think that there's no doubt it's very complicated, but we talk about looking at trauma, and I think, you know, I truly believe it's because it's so complicated and because we're talking about, you know, something that can be a crime, may not be a crime, but yet involves people in relationships. I mean, think about how difficult or how complicated our relationships are when there's no violence in them. You know, now you put violence into that relationship and it makes it that much more complicated.
Yes, you had your hand up. Yeah. All right. No. Yeah.
Oh, hi, good afternoon. Sigrid Maxwell from Lantern Community Services. I guess just to answer your question, I currently have 2 populations in my building, families and young adults, and we had a situation where one of my head of households was a woman, she was pregnant, and her boyfriend was the visitor. And he was extremely abusive. Unfortunately, their 2-month-old daughter passed away, and she saw him as a support system. So as a harm reduction, we allowed him to come into the building to visit during the hours that staff were on site. So we were kind of able to monitor that on a trial basis. So just share that.
Yeah, and just also, and Maureen mentioned this before, but there are protective orders that you can get that are limited instead of full stay away, no contact types of orders. So, if a judge sees fit, they could order, they could decide on an order of protection being limited so that 2 people can live together, can have physical contact, but have to refrain from the harassment, the emotional, verbal abuse, physical abuse, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Gentlemen?
So how, do you have any thoughts about how to address situations where the couple has brought the staff into the dynamic and is sort of triangulating their relationship through the staff? I work for a large service organization with homeless individuals, and there's an overlap of staff at the male facility and the female facility. One particular staff member goes back and forth, and the person who is doing the harm knows that she works at the other site, and so tries to use her to check up on the other person. So how do we, staffing issues aside, like not being able to say we can just change the staffing, how do we sort of address that structurally or systemically?
I mean, I would say that, you're never going to control the individual's behavior other than, setting some rules and regulations and being able to follow through on them. Say, if you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to be out of the facility. But I really think that the important thing is maybe doing some training with the staff so that they understand the dynamics of domestic violence and how some people who cause harm can be very manipulative and very creative in how they abuse their partner or their ex-partner, and and how that can place that other person at harm. So I think training might be helpful.
You're also seeing the control take on a new dynamic.
Right.
So now you're seeing the control shift from being around the partner to being around the staff person, and helping that staff person and giving that staff person enough support to really be mindful of the interactions. And it really does take you to a place of looking at doing some training around being non-judgmental. And really, it's treating this client the same way I treat that client, and really being very equal and very fair in all of my treatment for everyone across the board. So
it happens a lot at the FJC too. We are an open walk-in center essentially. So abusive partners come in all the time and sit down and say, I'm the victim, this is what's happened. And so we have to train our staff, our frontline staff, to be able to ask the right questions. And when those hairs go up on your arm, you kind of have a sense about things, how to kind of follow through with that too. Because again, sometimes it can be very difficult, and sometimes we do end up, sending people on who, after an initial intake, we realize, ooh, this is not the right match for services. But how do we say that without saying you're an abuser, right?
Right.
So,
It's your partner's fault that you
right.
can't get service.
It's tricky. It's very tricky, because like Maureen said, abusive partners are very manipulative. They get systems and they get how to use them and for their own benefit.
Other questions?
I'm Deborah Vogel from the State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, and I sit on the ESHI work group that decides on the funding for the new supportive housing initiative. And I'm kind of wondering who, besides Chris, who identified, if anybody else here is a developer or a program that's going to apply for the ESHI supportive housing? Because the workshop, I'm learning a lot. It's not kind of answering some of the questions that I came with. But one of my concerns is that, because this is going to be a whole new source of funding for new supported housing. So it won't be existing programs, it'll be new apartments developed. And representing the DV sort of population, I'm very concerned in the choices that we make that the applicants that are awarded funding take into account all the safety concerns that are really essential for domestic violence survivors. And it's probably a little bit less of an issue for programs that are applying that are already DV providers in some way, because hopefully they really have the right background and training and thinking. But there are going to be a lot of projects that have mixed populations. So I'm concerned about what, it's similar to Chris's question, like how, and maybe this group can't really answer the sort of structural issues, but what are some of the really important things that we need to make sure are built into or are present in those projects to make sure survivors are safe, even including something like should the building be identified as even having domestic violence survivors?
Right.
I mean, some really basic questions about what, and also a little bit about how do you balance protection for, because most of, it's been fascinating to listen to some of the struggles you all are having with some of the folks that you're already serving. The people that will be coming, at least initially, to these programs will be women who've already decided to leave and so, are coming kind of already separating from that relationship. And so the safety, at least initially, is to protect them from that relationship. But how do you balance safety versus independence? Because it is independent apartment living. So if you guys could address that a little bit.
Just to focus in on the mixed population issue, offering services across the board that are equal to everyone is always a good idea, because you never know who is experiencing what. And when we talk about statistics around domestic violence, we're talking about 1 in 3.
Yeah.
It's a huge, huge percentage of the
Right,
population.
and I think the hands around the room, almost everybody raised their hand if they've had circumstances that they've had to address with regard to IPV, and they're not running DV programs.
Right. So
But
across
by
the board.
definition, to some degree, they're running DV programs.
I mean, I would say that, I think that it's just the fact that there's recognition that, domestic violence cuts across all of these spectrums is really, really key. I would also recommend, I'm a big believer, particularly for staff, develop policy. Because if you have good policy and direction for your staff, that can help when situations arise. It's not the answer, because particularly since this is very complex, but it can really be helpful. And if it's going to be a domestic violence policy and you're creating it, speak to your partners who work in the domestic violence field. Like we've done, we're an agency that has developed policy around staff who identify as victims of domestic violence, and we've lent our expertise to other agencies, whether it be another domestic violence provider or other agencies who are not, but know that staff come forward, because now it's not just about that staff person, it's about the site, and the potential risk to that site that as an employer, you have to assess and look at.
And I think also recognizing the impact of developing trauma-informed programs. And I think, domestic violence is going to be present no matter what type of program you're building. But folks in supportive housing can be vulnerable to lots of different things, be it domestic violence or other types of violence or other factors. So I think, when developing new programs, taking the time to think about what trauma-informed looks like, how that might differ from programs that are already in existence, what that means sort of bringing staff into developing, sort of new policies and new trainings and so on is really important. And I think that it's everything down to sort of the person at the front desk and how they're able to engage folks, right?
I think that's all the time we have. Let's go, real quick, go ahead.
What safety plans do you develop to protect the staff? Because many times, you know it's domestic violence, but many times when the staff is involved, they would become the third person, as he said, was the third person like seen as the enemy. Do you have, any plans, for staff to protect them?
Start with their fears and start with what they're saying are their concerns, and then move from there. So you have to hear what their concerns are first and what they're really need to explore around their own safety, and then you can move from there. That's the way you start on any safety plan. So using a form might not always work.
And I would add to that I think that just to go back to policy, if it's something that you're seeing happening at your site, look at do you need a policy to address that? And maybe like we have, in addition to our policy, we have a site safety team that when an incident occurs, we meet on an emergency basis to talk about that specific incident, because just like with an individual who's a victim of domestic violence, safety planning that happens is going to be individualized for that situation.
I think there's a great note on which to end, which I think the sort of overall message here is that we're in this together, that we don't live in silos, that people come with all of their challenges, not just the one that may have gotten them on the face of it into supportive housing, but the whole picture, and that there are resources. And so speaking of resources, we've got some handouts up front.
Can I just say, and Dan, also, I didn't put these out, but these are our mayor's office palm cards. I brought a ton, so you can take a bunch back to your desks. These have all of our Family Justice Center numbers, the Safe Horizon number, and give a sort of little spiel about, what to do if you're in a dangerous situation. So I didn't put them out, but they're up here.
And I think all are available to stay for a few minutes if people have individual requests. Thank you to Joscelyn, to Maureen, to Lisa. And thank you all for joining us.